1. This happened a good few years ago. Some context. I was in my early 20s, single and living by myself. Most of my family lived about a 4-hour drive away from me. I was working for a small call center that provided, among other things, phone services for a 24-hour plumbing company. So they needed someone on the line at all times. My shift ran from 8 p.m. to whenever my boss showed up to pick up the line, which was usually 6 a.m. I worked in a building that housed several businesses of some sort. Call center work mostly, though we were the only one that had 24-hour services. Because of budget cuts, I was always the only operator on my floor. The only people in the building at night were myself and the security guy, who came by to do his rounds twice a night. Now, because the line had to be on 24/7, I was never allowed to disconnect while I was there. I ran to and from the bathroom, ate meals sitting in front of the computer, and every once in a while sneaked a cigarette at the window within sight of the screen. Only the light above my computer was on. Everything else was turned off when everyone went away around 10 p.m., so I was left in this half-darkness beneath a spotlight. I desperately needed that job to support myself, so despite the crap conditions, I kept repeating that it wasn't that bad. Things were usually quiet after 10 p.m. I could use the extra hours on my paycheck, and didn't need to get a second job. I did a lot of reading and even considered going back to school because of nothing else. The night shift would afford me plenty of time to study. So one night, around 2 a.m. or so, I got a call. I introduced myself as I always did. "Hello, you're calling so-and-so. My name is Jill. How may I help you?" The guy on the other side repeated my name and hung up. Working phone services on the night shift, you get used to a lot of weird stuff, so I shrugged it off and went back to my book. Then he called again and asked if he was speaking to Jill. I said yes, repeated the company name, and asked how I may help. He hangs up. The third time around, he asks if this is Jill on the phone, and I ask to whom I'm speaking. He hangs up again. The next time he calls, he's breathing hard on the phone and tells me he wants me to talk to him, and he's not gonna hurt me. I jot down his number and I start hanging up whenever his call pops up, which was the better part of an hour. This went on for months. When he realized I was hanging up every time I saw that number, he began calling from a restricted number, meaning I never knew if it was a legit call and ended up answering. All the time this guy keeps saying he wants me to talk to him, and that he's not gonna hurt me. The one time I counted, I hung up on this guy over 200 times in one night. Every time he would call, I'd say the company name, and as soon as I heard him, I hung up. I complained to my boss and she did nothing. Instead, she laughed the whole thing off because he obviously didn't know where I was. And he was only a voice on the line and I was perfectly safe. Sometime into this, I started talking to co-workers, and here's where it started getting really creepy. He never called on my days off, when someone else would be covering my shift. Indeed, at one point I changed shifts with a co-worker and he didn't call that day. At the time, I was getting pretty spooked by the whole situation, and the fact that my boss did zero to try and stop this. My co-workers were sympathetic and told me that if my boss did nothing, I should file a complaint myself. But I'm not sure I could, since this wasn't happening on my personal number. None of them could walk me home since I was the only operator in night shift. Everyone else was gone by the time my boss arrived and I left the office. I got a little paranoid, because obviously this guy knew my schedule pretty well, and even if I changed shifts, he would only call if he knew I was on the line. It had to be someone who could see me. I started doing commute with my cell phone in hand at all times, with the emergency number dialed in. Sometimes I did the whole commute on the phone with friends or relatives to keep calm. Since it's illegal to carry pepper spray here, at one point I considered walking around with a box cutter in my purse. That's how afraid I was. One day before my shift started, I was at the entrance of the building smoking a cigarette before showing up. And I see the security guy come by. Same fellow who usually did the night shift, this huge guy. I didn't really know him, never spoke much to him. Only said good evening or goodbye when I went by his desk, and whenever he came to my floor to do his rounds. I usually kept to myself, and I never really made any small talk or anything, just greeted him out of politeness. And he greeted back. He asked for a light, so I gave him my lighter, and he told me he'd been fired and he was going home. And he went on to tell me he always got the impression I was afraid of him, since I was never friendly or welcoming, exact words. Then he told me he was never gonna hurt me, and just walked away. I lost every drop of blood I had in me. I went inside to tell my boss the whole thing and discovered the guy got fired for harassing women in other floors, going as far as trying to corner someone in one of the elevators. The complaints piled up and he lost his job. Most of the time his shifts matched mine, so he would see me come in at 8 p.m. and left before I did. I asked my boss for that phone number again to come forward on this guy, ask the security company if that was his number. She told me she threw it away. When I told her the story, she found it cute. Exact word. Then she asked me if I was sure it was him because a voice on a phone is different and maybe you got it wrong. Exact words. Quality assurance told us time and again that our every call was recorded, so I demanded recordings. That's when I found out that again, because of budget cuts and whatnot, the night shift was never recorded, so I had no evidence. Once the guy was fired, the calls stopped. I didn't work there for much longer after that. So yeah, I have this guy's face imprinted in my mind. Hope I never meet him again. 2. This happened in 2011 to 2012. My boyfriend at the time, John, and I were 19, and we had just moved in together, both away from home for the first time. We were ecstatic. We picked a first-floor, 2-bedroom apartment so we'd have space for a roommate, in a large complex near our college. Thinking it would be perfect for us, spoiler alert, it ended up being a total dump. The first couple months were idyllic. We felt safe enough in the area to go on nightly bike rides to get snacks. And then we started having problems. First, our crappy little car was broken into. The window was smashed and the GPS, affectionately named Dottie, was stolen. We reported it to the police and informed our apartment complex. The landlord's response was a compassionate, "It's not our fault." A couple of weeks later, we were laying in bed when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart past the window. Our bed was right underneath it. I jumped up and looked at the closed blinds, only to be greeted by the crouching silhouette of what looked like a man in baggy clothing and a beanie. He appeared to be trying to listen for any movement, possibly trying to see through any crack in the blinds. I was too terrified to look out the blinds, but John did, and told me he couldn't get a look at him. Our presence didn't seem to deter the figure at all. We called the cops and waited. The guy finally took off after 15 minutes of just crouching at our window. An officer arrived an hour after we called and said he'd do a sweep of the area, but he'd already been gone for 45 minutes by then. The guy, well, I assume it was the same one, showed up a few times a week for months. No matter the temperature, no matter the weather. We called the cops each time, but to no avail. We actually started to get used to him looking in, and after a long period of no escalation, got complacent and began to wonder if he was just a peeping Tom. Or eavesdropping Tom? Of some sort, rather than someone casing the joint, as we initially assumed. It was always the same thing. He would show up, and we would see his silhouette crouch outside our window for about 15 minutes until he left. The worst part was that I could never see his face or anything. He was too well covered, and it was too dark. Essentially, we were being hunted by this creepy, faceless, crouching shadow. We finally bought thick curtains for the bedroom so he couldn't see in anymore. Not sure why that particularly bright idea took so long to appear in our heads, but I'm pretty sure we'd both be the dumb people in a horror movie. I think half the reason we bought the curtains was because we didn't want to see him anymore. Out of sight, out of mind, and all that. And there seemed to be no other choice but ignorance with how unhelpful and unconcerned the cops had been. And indeed, with curtains permanently drawn, we stopped thinking about him for a little bit. John's younger sister was living with us at the time. She was very much a capable woman, so we weren't too worried about leaving her alone while we went on a short vacation. She had never complained about the creeper, though she was aware of him, and he didn't seem to stop by her window. Neither her room nor the living rooms had the same thick curtains as the bedroom. We had our vacation, and when we came back, the first thing she said to us was, "So your friend stopped by?" Our eyes grew wide. The creeper. She nodded, and went on to explain that she was in the living room playing video games in the dark, when he walked up to the living room window, with blinds drawn, put a flashlight against the window and began knocking on it. Knocking. She had screamed, ran to the bathroom, locked herself in, and called 911, but it was the same story. The cops took forever to show up, and by the time they did again, the creeper was long gone. This set something off in John. Now the creeper seemed to be escalating, and the jerk was fucking with his little sister. I'm positive if she'd called him when this was going down, we would have headed straight back to the apartment during our vacation. Which is probably why she didn't. She was considerate like that. He told me he was going to take care of it himself. I begged him not to. At the same time, I also kind of understood where he was coming from. My fear was not knowing whether the guy had a gun or not, but I gave up arguing. So we kept the curtains open that night, and waited for the creeper to show up. Around 1 a.m. he finally did. John grabbed a bat and walked calmly out of the apartment. I hid in the bedroom closet, phone already dialed to 911, terrified of what I was about to hear go down. What I did hear was John giving off a terrifying guttural scream, somewhere near the back corner of the building, followed by the shadow of the guy outside the thin bedroom window standing up, stumbling, falling back, then standing up again and running off. I heard the footsteps of John go charging past the thin bedroom window as he continued uttering that freaky scream. When John came back inside unscathed, the mixture of relief and the hilarity of his terrifying howl led us both to laughing until our stomachs hurt. It was kind of awesome to realize what a wimp the guy who had been scaring us for months turned out to be once confronted. And that was it. We even kept the curtains open to see if he'd come back. But that was the last we saw of the creeper, and I hope to never officially meet him. Incidentally, our apartment was burglarized not too long after, along with the neighbors on the same day, but we couldn't confirm if it had anything to do with this guy. Seems obvious, although isn't that an awfully long time to be casing the apartment of 3 poor college students? But the police were entirely unconcerned, even bored by the whole thing. There were cameras in the hallway, but the complex told us, of course, they weren't working that day. We moved out a couple months before our lease was up, because we couldn't stand the place anymore. 3. So this takes place about 6 months ago at my job. Some background. I'm 19 years old, 18 at the time. I work at a small amusement park and arcade in a semi-rural area, which generally will have a good amount of people. This happened during our summer season, so we were open until 9 p.m., but we generally only have at most 10 families around 6:30 to 7. I mostly work outside as a ride attendant, so I get a lot of customer interaction from people all the time, and don't usually think much of it. On to the story. I had come into work at around 3 p.m., and my day was going normally. At around 3:30 I was running one of the roller coasters, which has a big box for the operator to run the ride from. These 2 kids show up. One looked about 8 years old and the other about 15 or so. They seemed very sweet and very funny, so I was just enthusiastically telling them the rules and just being as kind as I possibly could so they could enjoy themselves. As soon as the ride would finish, they'd run from the exit right back into line and go again, which isn't unusual because I get kids that do that all the time. Sometimes I'll even have kids who will do it over and over again for an hour or more. Soon enough, they stopped riding and waved me off as they ran to some other rides to have fun. At some point afterwards, one of my co-workers came up to switch positions with me and sent me off to the Tilt-A-Whirl, another ride we have. As I'm walking down, I see from a distance a man in a black shirt standing at our gem mining station. It's just a smallish water tower that constantly releases water, so kids can sift through sand and get cool rocks and such. He was just holding his hand in the water, so I was going to ignore him as I made my way to the ride. As I'm getting closer, he looks me up and down and asks for my name. I couldn't lie about it, obviously, since I had a name tag on, so I just told him. He then proceeds to say, "You think I could see you later tonight?" To which I respond, no. I walked away to the ride I was operating and told a coworker about what happened. We laughed it off as if it were nothing, and I sent him on his way to the ride he had to run. Not even 5 minutes later, the guy shows up to my ride with the 2 kids who I let on the roller coaster I was previously running. I'm of course not looking forward to letting him on, but I toughed it out, since the kids were just trying to enjoy themselves. They walk up to the entrance of the ride, and I ask the man if he could hold the fence door open as I scanned his wristband. The fence door opens inward, and the scanner is on the opposite side, so I ask customers to hold it open so I don't block them as they try to get on the ride. He responded with, "Of course. I'll do anything for you. Whatever you want." As I scanned their wristbands, the scanner showed that they had run out of credits, so I made sure to tell them. The younger kid with him looked upset, so I told them they could get on the ride this one time, and they could just go talk to the front counter after. I put them on and explained the rules of the ride, and ran it as usual. The entire time that the ride was running, I noticed the man was staring at me. He never let his eyes off of me, so I tried my hardest to avoid his gaze. I tried not to seem alarmed, because his kids were in the other carts joking around and making funny faces and gestures at me, trying to make me laugh, so I just pretended I didn't notice the man. Once the ride finished, the youngest kid stood up and said he wanted to go again. I felt bad for him, and since there wasn't any people in line, I told him he could go on again. The older kid felt dizzy, so he just got off the ride while the man and younger child stayed on. I ran it again. I noticed the man was still not letting his gaze off of me. Toward the end of the ride, I saw he was lifting up his lap bar, so I told him to leave it down. It acts as a second brake to slow down individual carts. Later, once the ride came to a stop, I looked over at him to tell him about the front counter, only to notice he had put his hand in his pants to make his crotch more noticeable. I was highly disturbed, of course, because I was literally not trying to be forced to look at some dude's excited phase. I quickly made sure they left and just avoided looking at the man the entire time. Later, once I had no more customers, I made sure to go to my supervisor at the time. I explained to her what happened, but she didn't know what the guy looked like, just what his older son looked like. As I was telling her, she saw the older son in the parking lot leaving, so we assumed they were gone for good at that point, and we sort of went back to normal working. I was still on edge because I was super uncomfortable, but I just talked to my coworkers to pass the time. At around 6 or so, my supervisor asked me to take cardboard down to the dumpster. I went down alone, so there weren't many people nearby. The dumpster is sort of close to some rides, so you could see what was going on from other points at the park. As I'm throwing away cardboard, I notice a figure walking down toward the dumpsters, and see it's the same guy from earlier. He had come back to the park again. I start to freak out, because I didn't have a walkie-talkie on me and there wasn't anyone nearby to do anything. He kept walking closer and closer, eyeballing me every so often, as I internally start panicking and getting increasingly nervous. I thought in that moment that I was going to be kidnapped, and I didn't even know what to do. Thankfully, my supervisor saw him from a distance and started speed-walking in my direction. She walked right past him before he could get to me, and he did a double take and just stood there as if he wasn't walking toward me. She walked me back up and told me that she didn't know if that was the guy but didn't want to leave me there alone. She switched me to another ride and said she'd make sure he didn't follow me around. She had told some other co-workers about what happened, and a co-worker from before made sure to stay near me because the guy kept lingering at some areas, looking at me, and trying to be near me when he thought my guard was down. Every time my co-workers thought he was getting too close, they'd stand near me and make sure he left me alone. At some point, his youngest kid came back to the ride I was operating, and stayed on until closing time came about. So the guy was nearby for a lot of the time. Toward closing, I was offered a ride home from a coworker because he didn't want me to be alone walking to the parking lot. As we go outside, we sit on the stairs with some other co-workers, and we notice this car was still in the parking lot, even though at that point we had been closed for about 45 minutes. The guy was still there with his family and everything, just lingering. There were no other cars in the customer parking lot except for them. So I assumed this dude had to have some of his own family involved, because he was just waiting there. I can't see any other reason he'd be there. It felt too coincidental that his family just so happened to stay later than they had to. I kept nervously looking over and looking to see what he was doing, and he was just staring in our direction as he just sat while his family was doing some other stuff. Thankfully at some point they had left, but I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable at the thought of if I was just completely alone when I left. I'm so glad I have some responsible and caring co-workers, because if not, I have no idea what would have happened. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 382. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Right, I want to run an idea by you. You are the guys who watch the videos, so I want to know what you think. Now, in terms of the channel, overall, the funnier videos do much, much better than everything else. What that basically means is the True Scary Stories videos, which used to be the most popular thing on the channel, are now way down the list. The poorest performing are the glitch, followed by the paranormal, then the True Scary Stories. So, would you want me to keep doing 2 a week, Monday and Wednesday, or drop down to 1 a week, and let's say I do it on Monday, and fill in Wednesday with something else? Maybe I could try and make Impractical Parents a weekly feature, instead of bi-weekly, or like I do with the Neckbeards or something. Not making any changes, just throwing ideas out there. I'd like some feedback. I want to know what you think. And if it's a popular enough opinion, then I'll see about making some changes. Okay, and with that I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.